event is before I have to leave, and then I will just.
All right, everybody, welcome again. So glad to have you here this morning. Welcome to North Korea in Global Focus, Security, Human Rights, and Shared Stories. My name is Sarah Jones. I am the director of the SIS Office of Career Development, and our office is a co-host of the event today, and I get to welcome you on behalf of SIS. Many hands throughout SIS made this happen. A special thanks to the SIS events team, the Department of Peace, Human Rights, and Cultural Relations, the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security, and the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific Studies Initiative. We are so delighted to welcome Ambassador Julie Turner today in a fireside chat with moderator and SIS faculty member Dr. Jiyoung Lee. We'll introduce both of them and get right to the conversation very shortly. But first, I want to introduce SIS SPA alumnus Andrew Jung, who is president of the Sejong Society, who is co-hosting the event.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrew Jung, and I'm the president of Sejong Society. The Sejong Society is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization dedicated to informing, developing, and connecting young professionals interested and engaged in U.S.-Korea affairs. Through network events and policy programming, we aim to be a space for young, aspiring Korea policy professionals to engage with top experts, network, and provide opportunities for professional development through our programming and memberships. We are excited to be partnering with SIS on this wonderful event with Ambassador Turner and Dr. Lee. Now I will turn it over to Ambassador Piper Campbell, Chair of the Foreign Policy and Global Security Department at SIS, who will introduce our guests.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. So, as Andrew said, my name is Piper Campbell. I am the chair of the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security. I'm also the director of the ASEAN and Indo-Pacific Studies Initiative. And in both of those roles, I work closely with our moderator, Professor Jiyoung Lee, who is a member of our department and whose Korea and Global Affairs initiative perfectly complements the student-focused and academic work of APSI. Jiyoung's students know her as SIS's own C.W. Lim and Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies, a role she has held since 2011. They may also have read her book, her important book, China's Hegemony, 400 Years of East Asian Domination, which was published in 2016. However, they probably don't know yet that Jiyoung will soon publish a new book, The Great Power Next Door, the past and present of Chinese military intervention in the Korean Peninsula. Or that her last year's article, Decoupling from China, how U.S. Asian allies responded to the Huawei ban, was shortlisted for the Boyer Prize, which is awarded annually to the best article published in the Australian Journal of International Affairs. Professor Lee brings a depth of knowledge to her today's role moderating this conversation. And I must say that I love the way that this conversation has been titled and structured to make the connections that sometimes I think are not made with enough strength between security, human rights, and connecting security and human rights to the individual, to the stories. And so I really look forward to the conversation around making the connections between those three things. As someone who myself worked to support North Korean refugees overseas, has seen the way North Korean workers overseas are abused and taken advantage of, and has had the opportunity to hear firsthand stories of the dreadful human rights situation within North Korea. I know that Ambassador Julie Turner, I'm honored to have the opportunity today to introduce our speaker, Ambassador Julie Turner, the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues. And I know that she, through her work and also through her approach, is sort of the perfect person to make these connections between security, human rights, and these individual stories, these shared stories. Ambassador Turner has worked over the past 20 years to strengthen democratic institutions and promote human rights throughout East Asia and the Pacific region in roles in both the State Department and the NSC. She is globally recognized as an expert in the areas of human rights and democracy, and has been extremely proactive since taking the special envoy role last year. While it's slightly outside the scope of this conversation, I want to share with the students present that Julie began her career in the civil service as a presidential management fellow at PMF. It's a wonderful program, which I hope that many of you will pursue, and perhaps during the Q&A, we might be able to touch on that topic as well. It is my pleasure to invite Ji Young and Ambassador Julie Turner to please take their seats.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so very much for being here this morning. Wow, what an amazing introduction. I am truly impressed. Ambassador Turner, it's truly a privilege to welcome you to the School of International Service, where many of our students are deeply interested in human rights, North Korea, and careers in public service. It's not every day that we get to have an opportunity to directly hear from someone who has been at the forefront of improving the human rights situation in North Korea, representing the United States government in this critical endeavor. So thank you so much for being here with us this morning. A note on housekeeping business. So I have the honor of asking her 3-4 questions for the beginning part of our conversation. And then we will have about 20 minutes opening it up to the floor for Q&As from the audience. Yes? Okay, so Ambassador, I would like to begin by asking you a question about your role and responsibility in your position as the Special Envoy on North Korean human rights issues. And I mean, what are your top priorities? And also importantly, like, how do you see your work on human rights in North Korea relate to U.S. foreign policy in general?
It's always hard when somebody starts with what are your top priorities, especially when you work on North Korean human rights, because it's like the laundry list. I don't know whether any of you have ever had the opportunity to look at the UN Commission of Inquiry report on North Korean human rights. It's 400 pages long. And so when someone says, what do you pick first, or what are you going to tackle first? It's like, but I will say that I've kind of divided my work and priorities into 5 buckets. The first one being promoting access to information in North Korea. And a lot of that work also involves doing outreach to our allies and partners. We've worked very closely with the South Korean government on this effort. And we are working with the North Korean escapee community in South Korea. We're working with tech innovators in San Francisco to create tools, new delivery mechanisms that help push independent, credible forms of information into the hands of North Koreans that are living in one of the most repressive societies in the world. The second area of focus is promoting accountability for those most responsible for human rights abuses. And while criminal accountability is the goal, and something that we continue to work with civil society partners to document human rights abuses on, we are also thinking about the longer term reconciliation work that needs to be done with truth-telling and memorialization. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is also connecting North Korean escapee groups with accountability experts, with organizations even here in the United States, like the Holocaust Museum here in DC, or there's a great Holocaust and Human Rights Museum in Dallas that we've been able to help build connections with so that they can learn the value of the stories that they are documenting right now and what that may be used for in the future, especially to pass their stories on to future generations so that people don't forget what's happening in North Korea. The third area is the one that I think we all hear about a lot, and in particular while thinking about North Korea's neighbor, China, is the issue of forced repatriations. One of the things that I've been very focused on is calling on China as well as Russia to stop the practice of forced repatriations of North Korean refugees. North Korea is one of the only countries in the world where they're actually trying to trap their people inside. I was just in Geneva last week at the Universal Periodic Review, and the North Korean government said, you know, these people are crossing the border illegally to leave our country. And I was like, only in the North Korea space is that like even a conversation. And then once they cross over, then they have to live in hiding in China, sometimes for up to 10 years, more than 10 years, before they're able to save enough money to find the right brokerage network that can help get them to safety in Southeast Asia and then onward to either South Korea or one of the other countries around the world that accepts North Korean refugees. And so we're doing what we can to help build pressure on the PRC as well as Russia to stop this egregious practice. The fourth area of work that I'm focused on is has a domestic outreach component, and that is talking to the Korean American divided families community, letting their voices be heard in the policymaking process, as well as to make sure that we're undertaking steps right now, given the age of many of the divided family members. And for those of you who don't know, these are people who were maybe born in the North before the war, and then over the course of the war had to flee and were separated from a loved one, whether it was their parents or a brother or a cousin. They may have made it to the South and then immigrated to the United States, but still often think about the family members that they left behind. And over the years, different processes have allowed some South Korean nationals to be able to be reunited or to meet their loved one again. But for many Korean Americans, they've been outside of that process. And so we are trying to make sure that we're doing a good job of figuring out what that population looks like in the United States, creating a channel or a venue for them to also maybe store those messages that they want to send back, since so many of them are in their 80s and 90s and may not see a day where they're able to be reunited with their brother or sister. So that's been both a top priority for me because of the sense of urgency, but also a really meaningful experience for me as a Korean American, as an adoptee myself who has taken a journey looking for broader family connections. Really hearing these stories, it's heartbreaking to think about the separation that is really only the result of a government's repressive policies that prevents that freedom of movement that would allow, and even the freedom to communicate with each other, right? You can't even send a letter to your loved one. So that one is the fourth priority. The fifth area is probably the toughest one, and that is actually pressuring the North Korean government to create concrete improvements or concrete change in their human rights record. I was just in Geneva last week for the DPRK's Universal Periodic Review, where we got to hear from the North Koreans how they think they're doing in terms of their human rights record. And then the international community had the opportunity to put forward recommendations. On the US government side, we of course called for the North Koreans to respect a lot of key civil and political rights, including dismantling the political prison camps, allowing for the freedom of movement that would allow for family reunifications, including South Korean detainees, abductees, and divided family members, and repatriated POWs, but also Japanese abductees as well. But we did also try to push the North Koreans to make concrete steps in an area where they've at least shown an initial willingness to make change, and that's in the area of disability rights. And so we urge them to reform some of their domestic laws to include language that conforms with international standards. And so while that may be a baby step, that is an area where we have seen them willing to engage with the international community. They have invited the UN Special Rapporteur on persons with disabilities to visit North Korea in the past. And so we want to take advantage of this interest on their part to see if we can use that as a possible gateway to change.
Thank you. I think it just shows how North Korea related issues and challenges are truly global in scope and also very complex. One of the things that I really wanted to ask you is this link or connection between human rights and national security. In your work, how do you view advancing, basically really working on advocating human rights for North Koreans? How does that advance United States and its allies' national security and other goals, global security challenges?
So I think the UN Commission of Inquiry laid a lot of the groundwork for this argument about the inextricable link between international peace and security and North Korean human rights. And I think the premise here is that a regime like North Korea is unconstrained by its own population because it maintains such repressive and total control. So there are no checks and balances like in our system. The people can't petition the government for a particular outcome. If Kim Jong-un wakes up on the wrong side of the bed one day and decides that he's going to fire off a rocket, then he can do that. And the people can't stop him, which creates an environment that is unstable and insecure for everyone on the Korean Peninsula, everyone in the Indo-Pacific, and everyone around the world. He's also able to, for instance, deploy 10,000 troops to Russia to assist in Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. And there is no ability for the North Korean people to protest. If they tried, that would be clamped down almost immediately. It's not only in the domestic repression, but it's also in these other connections, like North Korea's practice of sending workers overseas. There are many countries around the world that continue to host North Korean workers, including Russia. And these workers work and live in conditions that amount to forced labor. They live in forced labor conditions. That money that they make, oftentimes working 18-hour days or sometimes longer, is paid directly to the regime, and the regime takes 80% of that income and uses it to fund all sorts of other illicit activities, including its weapons program.
Thank you. Of course, when we think about North Korea in your work, it is about helping the people who suffer every day. And you briefly mentioned this earlier in your remark. You're engaging with Korean American community, those families separated in the United States who have family members in North Korea. Can you tell us the stories of your engagement with this community, individuals and the people?
Yeah, these have been some of the most moving and heartbreaking moments of my career, to be honest. And meeting with 80 or 90-year-old individuals, some of whom, in their 90s are still so committed to seeing their family member that they're willing to get on a plane from Los Angeles to fly to Washington, D.C. to meet with me. I've been trying to get out. I've done a lot of domestic travel so that they don't have to make that long journey. But they want to come into the State Department and have their voice be heard. And for many of them, these are the stories that literally there are movies that are made about. One of the women talks about fleeing with her brothers, but her eldest brother stayed behind with her father, and the younger older brother ended up fighting on the South Korean side during the war, and the eldest brother fought on the North Korean side during the war. One of the brothers died in the course of the war, but this is the kind of just heartbreak that exists in this community, and that it was literally brothers fighting against one another. And for many of these individuals who, they just want answers. Where was my mom buried? Can I go back to my hometown someday? Can I be buried in my hometown someday? And really, one of the things that these interactions have inspired me to work harder and to advocate more to make sure that those considerations are factored into our policymaking. But beyond just the individuals that were divided over the course of the war, I've had the opportunity to meet with many North Korean refugees and escapees, both in Seoul and here in the United States, who similarly have stories of separation. I just, while in the UK, met a young woman who was learning traditional Korean music as her path choice that the regime had pushed her into in North Korea. And as a 16-year-old, she was like, I don't really want to play traditional Korean music. I want to play Western style guitar music. And so she, as like a teenager, crossed the border into China thinking that she would be okay. But she was a young teenager and realized, oh, I miss my mom. And I want to go home. So she tried to go home. But when she went back across the border, she was arrested and sent to a political prison camp. And because even the inner workings of the North Korean system, the political prison camps, a lot of the human rights abuses are hidden even from the broader population, she didn't really know what to expect, and ended up spending months in this camp. After she was released from the camp, she did escape again, and now is living in the UK. She has taken up the Western guitar and has studied classical guitar music and plays in and around the London area. And it's just really inspiring to hear her talk about how music and the dream of opportunity was what she knew she was missing when she was in North Korea. Even as a teenager, she was able to think, that's what I want, and I can only have it in freedom. And so hearing these stories of people that have overcome so much is what has kept me going after 20 years of working on probably one of the most protracted human rights crises around the world.
Thank you. It's really heartbreaking. I mean, I actually remember when I was a kid, there will be some event showing on the TV, reunion of separated families when North and South Korean relations were good at that time. I can't remember the details. And I just remember crying a lot because what we're talking about is basically human beings, parents, children, siblings. And so, yes, thank you so much for sharing the stories and actually working for these family members. So speaking of, our personal journeys, I'm very curious, and I'm sure our students too, about your personal journey, if it's okay to find yourself here as a Korean American woman in US foreign policy. You briefly mentioned what motivates you, but why have you stayed in the State Department for 20 years? It's a long time.
It is a very long time. I'm definitely not counting the minutes at my, no, just kidding. I love my job, and I will tell that to everybody and anybody who asks. I work on really hard, heartbreaking issues, not just in the North Korea context, but over the course of my career, I've worked with Chinese dissidents, Uyghur camp survivors as well. I've worked with all sorts of activists from Myanmar to Vietnam. And those people that continue to speak out despite all of the repression and hardship that they've had to overcome in their lives are the ones that have kept me going. But my journey, I guess, it actually dates back to being an adoptee. I've always felt this deep sense of gratitude to America for giving me opportunity. And so since I was a young child, I've always known that public service was what I was going to do. So there's never been any question in my mind that I would work for the government. Interestingly, and this is turned into a myth within the State Department, but especially right now, my world is colliding with the North Korean deployment to Ukraine because the American family that adopted me is of Ukrainian heritage. And so I spent a lot of time growing up in like traveling to Ukraine. I spoke a little bit of Russian because my grandmother was Russian speaking on that side of my family. And actually felt more of a connection to that part of the world than I did Korea. And so when I came into the government as a presidential management fellow, I thought that I would work on Ukraine, to be quite frank, and ended up after just a couple of months in the department, in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, there was an opening on the East Asia account. And so my boss shifted me over to work on Korea and a number of Southeast Asia countries, and I have been working in that space ever since. When I started working on Korea, I was scared out of my mind because my only experience with Korea was Korean Saturday morning school that my parents had sent me to as a youngster. My Korean was terrible. It still is terrible, so don't test me on it. But so I didn't really know anything. I mean, Korean history, Korean culture, I had little bits of that from this experience at Korean Saturday morning school. And my parents had really encouraged me to explore my Korean heritage, but it wasn't an integral part of me. But over the course of the past 2 decades, while working on North Korea issues, I have not only come to really love and appreciate Korean culture, Korean history, but also the community, right, that we have, the great people-to-people ties that the US and South Korea have, and really defined a sense of community within the North Korean human rights activist community. It is like an extended part of my family now, and it is passionate. I am passionate about it, which is why I say, like, I get up in the morning, and even though I know I'm going to be beating my head up against the North Korean regime wall, I still feel motivated to go and to keep engaging and to keep pushing so that hopefully someday we can see a free and open North Korea.
Wow, thank you so very much for sharing such precious story. Thank you so much. Actually, finally, for this part of the dialogue, do you have any advice for our students who are interested in pursuing a career in public service, including the State Department? Any advice?
I have very tactical advice, but I also have kind of somewhat vague advice. I'll start with the vague advice and then I'll get tactical. I recently was speaking with a mentor of mine at the State Department who just retired after more than 30 years in the Foreign Service and multiple ambassadorships, and asked him what his advice was to young diplomats at the department. And he said, sometimes it's all about the timing. And that is something that has certainly proven true in my own career. A lot of the opportunities that have come up, it's been all about the timing. The fact that there was a East Asia position that was open at that time that pushed me into the North Korea track, that took me down a very different path than I thought I was going to go down, but also has led me to where I am today. I have 4 kids. So over the course of the years, there have been other opportunities where the timing wasn't right. And we lived overseas when my spouse was a foreign service officer. And, you know, there were maybe some missed opportunities along the way, but different opportunities opened up. And so always remain open to the fact that you never know when the timing is going to be right. But when those opportunities appear, you might take that chance and find yourself with an amazing opportunity on the other end of it. The really tactical advice that I have for you right now is get a security clearance if you want to work for the government, and do it earlier. So apply for internships. That's the best way to do it, because that will make getting into federal service much easier at the end of the day. Because I almost always, as a hiring manager in the State Department, I have always like, oh, this person doesn't have security clearance. I could wait 2 years for this to go through, or I could hire this person over here that has one already. So thinking, I mean, really with a lot of the government service work, you do have to be thinking 2 or 3 years out. You should be, if you wanted a summer internship at the State Department, the application period started a couple of months ago. So, you know, now you're thinking about, okay, well, when does the spring process open up for next fall, right? And so you really do have to be thinking long term, if that's the way you want to go. Think about student programs like the Presidential Management Fellows Program, which was an amazing opportunity for me because it allowed for rotations to try out different things within the U.S. government. I got to work at an embassy overseas. I was actually in our embassy in Seoul for one of my rotations as a PMF. But also there are great programs like the Pickering Fellowship. There's now the Powell Fellowship, just really a lot of different student programs that can create openings and pathways into the U.S. government.
Thank you. Well, now we will take the floor to ask questions from the audience. If you don't actually mind coming up over to the microphone, and when you do so, if you could briefly introduce yourself, we'll appreciate it greatly.
Hi, Ambassador. I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. During the 30s and 40s, Stalin moved a considerable number of his North Koreans, and they are North Koreans with their accent, to Kazakhstan. And I asked the last Kazakh ambassador, if we could get North Koreans hiding in Manchuria to Kazakhstan, would you throw them out? Would you reject them? Would you treat them the way Laos and Vietnam have treated them, or would you let them in? And he ran it up the flagpole, and he came back to me and he said, let them in. They won't be rejected at the border where they occasionally are in Mongolia. And we've got plenty of Koreans who would help them out. And that, to be honest, probably add to our economy. I mean, this seemed like a win-win situation. So I wonder why China would resist letting these guys across the country to Kazakhstan rather than throwing them back to North Korea, where they're sure to be abused. I mean, can you help me out with that?
That's a great question. I think there are a couple of different things at play. One is that I think there are a lot of efforts that the Chinese are undertaking to prevent a lot of their own people from leaving China as well, right? This would be Uyghurs, this would be Chinese human rights activists. And to be completely frank, what oftentimes happens is that North Koreans get caught up in this dragnet that's actually set to catch all of these other populations. It's not necessarily targeting just North Koreans. And so movement through China from the Northeast to get to Kazakhstan would be very difficult. There is also the broader relationship, even if the Chinese feel uncomfortable with the growing partnership with Russia, they also need North Korea as a buffer state regardless. And so while they may not be willing to bend over backwards for the North Koreans on this, they're going to do that kind of bare minimum to kind of keep the system propped up in the way that it is. I think we're seeing a little bit of that right now, in that they really have not been taking on as much of a leading role on North Korea related issues at the UN. The Russians have been doing that for the North Koreans. I think because the Chinese realize they don't want to expend their political capital in that way, especially when they've got their own human rights record, for instance, to defend in that space. But that doesn't mean that in the meantime, you know, as more and more Chinese dissidents are starting to move and Uyghurs are starting to move again, with COVID restrictions gone and movement just being a little bit more fluid, that they're not going to continue to catch these North Koreans, and then rather than be seen as working with us on that, they're going to refoul them.
Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. My name is Ito. I'm a junior here at SIS and a student of Professor Lee. And I wanted to ask you, since we have seen over the last few months a very large shift in rhetoric away from reunification and peaceful reunification from the North Korean side, and we've seen a lot of efforts by Kim Jong-un's regime to eliminate any notion that a peaceful reunification is going to happen. I was wondering, from your perspective, how do you think it's going to affect the relationship that we have with North Korea, our ability to influence human rights, and in general, the human rights situation on the ground, both on a state level and for the individuals who on both sides have seen a peaceful unification, even in recent times, as a viable future?
That's a great question, and like a really big question to grapple with, because there are so many different components of how the reunification narrative on the North Korean side, and also how reunification affects South Korea's policies, and where the U.S. as a third party in all of this should stand. I think to tackle the part about how this affects the human rights situation specifically, I think there's a lot of interesting things that must be going on inside North Korea right now with the kind of like tossing of this reunification narrative, because essentially the North has created this understanding now that South Korea is different than the North. We're a separate country. They're a separate country. We're not same, which is fundamentally like something that the average Korean on either side of the border can't really accept when they know, for instance, with the divided families, that no, but that's actually literally my brother on the other side of the border, right? We're not different people. We are literally from the same mother's womb. And what does that mean? So there's got to be this extreme cognitive dissonance that's happening amongst the North Korean population. And then that raises the question, if this reunification narrative was all a lie or something that's so easily tossed out, what other things has the North Korean government been telling me that's a lie or could easily be changed on a whim? And so I think this creates an interesting messaging opportunity for like access to information efforts that both the South Koreans and the US government are doing to push more credible information in to help educate and inform North Koreans about the reality and what truths or what lies really expose the lies that they have been told over the years, which does hopefully create an environment where an informed citizenry can start doing some of those things that we would want governments or populations to do, which is to petition the government to start exercising different rights that they should be entitled to. I think more broadly, in terms of how we should approach this in the multilateral space, I think we have to keep in mind that separate from the reunification narrative, North Korea's human rights record is tied to international human rights law. They have signed certain international treaty bodies on human rights, and we should keep holding them accountable to those different commitments that they've made. They want to be viewed as a UN member state. We do recognize them as the DPRK. The UN recognizes them as the DPRK. So we should keep pushing them if they want to be in that multilateral space to play by the multilateral space's rules.
Hi, so thanks to SIS for hosting this event and Ambassador Turner for making time in your schedule for this. My name is Terrence Matsuo. I'm a member of the Sejong Society and a non-resident fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America. And my question is kind of focused on the refoulement of North Korean escapees. And earlier in your remarks, you mentioned that one of your kind of priorities is pushing on Russia and China to stop doing that. And so I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that, specifically kind of what are the sticks or carrots, I guess, to discourage China and Russia or really any other country from this kind of process. Thank you.
So a few of the things that we're doing, one is we're clearly publicly messaging on this. I've made delivered a number of public remarks focused on Russia and China's complicity in North Korean human rights abuses through this practice of forced labor of North Korean refugees. We also regularly talk directly to those governments about this issue, particularly the Chinese government, given the long history that they have of refouling North Koreans. Every time a civil society group brings a case to us where they flag, we know that these individuals were arrested in China, they're at risk of refoulement, we go in and we deliver a démarche to the Chinese government, calling on them to abide by their international commitments. I also want to say that in that process, we also want and are encouraging our like-minded partners to do this more and more as well, is to not forget that the North Koreans also have a role here and that we should also be calling them out on what the treatment is when those individuals are forcibly returned. Where are they? In October 2023, there were the reports that over 600 North Korean asylum seekers or refugees were forcibly repatriated to North Korea. We should continue to call on China to abide by the principle of non-refoulement, but also be saying to the North Koreans, where are these 600 people? You say, or China's telling us that they're not tortured when they're returned. Okay, show us. Why aren't they allowed to communicate with their family members? So remembering that there are two sides of this issue. In addition to that, we are using different UN mechanisms in China's Universal Periodic Review, while we also have a full range of human rights issues to raise with the PRC. We did submit advanced questions to the PRC, and one of those did focus on refoulement of North Koreans.
Hi, my name is Rachel. Thank you, Ambassador Turner, for being a role model for women in the State Department and being one of the first female ambassadors in North Korea. And my question is related to that, which is within the last 20 years, do you feel like the State Department has changed in terms of, seeking more female ambassadors, Korean Americans, increasing their diversity? How do you think that has changed over your career in the State Department?
That's a good question, and one that I will say the State Department is certainly still wrestling with. But I will say it is one that the State Department is wrestling with, which is half the battle, right? Is thinking about these things, thinking about ways to have more diverse representation, so that when we're sending our diplomats abroad, it does look like America looks. And I will also say that I have been in many meetings where people have been confused whether I'm the American diplomat or some other country's representative. And so I think it is really important that we push within the State Department system to make sure more women, more diverse representation is visible. When I came in, my shift to the East Asia portfolio was very much you're Korean American, and so you should work on East Asia. There are lots of Korean Americans that I've met in the State Department who speak Spanish quite well and want to work on Latin America. And, you know, I was coming in with some Russian and some French and maybe wanted to work on Europe. I'm completely happy where I am, but it is not lost on me that it was a very conscious decision to take the Korean American and put them on the East Asia account when that happened. But now we are in a place in the department after 20 years have passed where our EUR Bureau has a Korean American woman as the principal deputy assistant secretary, Yuri Kim, who has also served as an ambassador in the EUR Bureau. Julie Chung, who is another Korean American woman, is our ambassador to Sri Lanka right now. It is a very different landscape than when I came in 20 years ago, where there are female, Asian Americans, Korean Americans, people of color in different positions. I think it's really up to my generation within the department to continue to also make sure that we're creating an environment that allows for the retention of young talent so that people can rise through the ranks to those top positions. And I would encourage younger women, younger people of color coming into the department to understand that it is something that the department is wrestling with, and that it only changes though if people stay. And I will acknowledge that over the years, the department has had a retention issue, especially with women in certain regional areas in particular, deciding this isn't the bureau for me because there's no upward mobility for me as a woman. But if all the women leave that bureau, then we won't have people rise to the ranks that we want to see more women in. And so I'm committed to continuing to make sure that I'm also helping to create that space in the department. And there are a lot of allies across the department who are also working to be more thoughtful of those things.
My name is Stanley Kober. On the issue of deportations, seems to me we have a more serious problem, the incoming administration, quite frankly. Mass deportations now. If we accuse the Chinese of deporting people, they'll just go back at us and say, so what are you doing? We won't have the moral suasion. And that is true of a lot of other issues now, I think. To me, this is the biggest problem now. There's a difference between being the city on the hill and Zeus on Mount Olympus, where you're hurling thunderbolts at everybody else, while your actions are hidden in the clouds. That is the big dilemma we will have to confront. In this situation, who will take us seriously?
I guess is there a question there, or is that, okay?
To me, this is the biggest problem.
Having
So
worked
what's your
through,
favorite?
having worked through many administrations over the course of my career, especially in the human rights space, the US has always sought to be transparent about our own record. And I think that's one of the important things that we do need to remember is to approach that with a little bit of humbleness that we're not perfect. When I started working at the State Department, I started in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, which produces the annual country reports on human rights practices. And we always get poked at by other governments and sometimes by the media because we don't write a report on ourselves. But that is very intentional because we don't think that writing a report on ourselves would be viewed as credible. And so we've always told other governments, you're more than welcome to write a report on us. I will say the Chinese government writes a report on us. The North Korean government writes a report on us, which I highly recommend that you take a look at. I think Germany wrote a report on us for many years as well. I don't know whether they still do. And we do take those processes seriously. We do look at them. We also participate in the Universal Periodic Review at the UN as well, which is an opportunity for other governments to comment on our system. I think one of the things that we've really tried to underscore is that one of the differences between our system and the Chinese system or the North Korean system is that there are different mechanisms in place that allow for the kind of conversations that are happening, throughout this period, in the pre-election period, post-election period, where people are allowed to express their opinions freely, and that there are court processes in place that also allow for the system or for the people to really speak. And I do think that that is something that we can continue to stand on. Certainly, I've sat across the table from PRC diplomats or other diplomats from around the world and had them throw things back in my face about things that have happened here. But I think also you can read about that in the newspaper, so everyone in America knows that X, Y, or Z incident happened in the United States, and we can talk through those things. In North Korea, you can't read about those things. If there's a public execution, it's not something that is necessarily being reported to the international community that this happened yesterday. And so the checks and balances in our system are working, and that's something that I think we can continue to stand on when we are in these diplomatic conversations.
Hello. Thank you again for being here. My name is Isabella Long. I was really interested in the comment you made about disability rights in North Korea. I'm really interested in the CRPD, and I actually just submitted a Fulbright on the CRPD implementation in EU. But I was wondering what protections within the CRPD that you think will allow you to make some headway on other priorities within North Korea.
I think it's great that you're applying for a Fulbright. It's an excellent program. And I think that the space of disability rights is one where there's a lot of opportunity, especially because disability rights is such a great gateway conversation to broader rights-based conversations. From disability, you can talk about labor. From labor, you can talk about civil and political liberties. And so good luck with your application process. I had the opportunity to have an intern over the summer whose focus was disability rights, specifically in North Korea. And it's been really interesting because even my own understanding of this space has expanded significantly as a result of a lot of her research. We tend to think, especially in the North Korea context, of disability rights in a really narrow physical disabilities space, specifically from workplace accidents, because that tends to be the type of thing that they're interested in. But starting to think about it also in a broader provision of educational services and provision of healthcare to people maybe with non-visible disabilities is something that I think is an opportunity for us to really push the North Koreans on. There are organizations there is an organization in North Korea called the Korean Federation for Persons with Disabilities. There's a Chinese counterpart organization called the Chinese Federation for Persons with Disabilities. We recently, earlier this year, maybe late last year, restarted a bilateral dialogue with the Chinese Federation for Persons with Disabilities and really looking for opportunities to bring the North Koreans into that conversation so that they can learn from these types of processes. I think presents a new opportunity. But also getting the broader international community to understand what the impact of providing an inclusive and accessible environment for persons with disabilities can provide, right? This is also something that could, in the long run, be something that helps not just North Koreans with disabilities, but also North Korea in terms of prosperity, because when you're integrating persons with disabilities into your economy, we've seen statistically you get better outcomes with that. And so to the extent that any research or work that you're doing can help look for those threads that connect the benefits of making improved policies that better serve communities of vulnerable or marginalized populations like persons with disabilities to broader kind of socioeconomic benefits for a government could be really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking today, Ambassador. My name is Mike Domler. I'm a fellow at the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And I wanted to ask, over the past year, there's been reports of increased surveillance of North Korean escapees in China. However, it doesn't seem that they're like taking steps to refoul them after some of those major repatriations last year. I know you alluded to it in some of your answers to some of your questions, but do you see this as some sort of unofficial agreement between local security bureaus and, local populations that might have North Korean escapees in their families, or is it at a higher level the Chinese government that's making this decision? And is this in any way linked to the 75th anniversary and the relations that have been going on between China and North Korea this year?
I think one of the things that we've seen with the PRC, and this is taking my North Korea hat off a little bit and going back to my old job where I was the director for East Asia and the Pacific in DRL, is that a lot of China's surveillance activity, a lot of their efforts, we call it transnational repression, right, to find and bring home dissidents that have fled. It happens at a local to local level, which is really different than the way that we operate in the foreign policy space and sometimes makes it hard for democratic governments really to respond quickly enough. Because while we're sending a message to Beijing, it's like a local provincial office talking to a local provincial office in, not to pick on any country, I'll say North Korea because I can pick on them. No, that's terrible. But yes, so to answer your question, I do think a lot of this is probably more local to local. But that local to local also over the years has provided some level of protection for some of the North Koreans living in that area. So, there were upwards of 30,000 stateless children who were born to North Korean refugee women and probably Chinese fathers who weren't registered. We did see after the Commission of Inquiry report that at least at a local level, some of those kids started getting registered, and it was probably a decision that was being made at a very localized level. So right now, yes, probably some of the surveillance happening at a localized level, such and such security guard from whatever North Korean provincial unit talking to such and such, security unit on the Chinese side of the border. But there are absolutely national level surveillance controls that are being deployed by the Chinese, which again, in much the same way that the Dragnet is catching refugees that are crossing the border into Central Asia or into Southeast Asia. I would also assume that some of this is a nationalized process, and that there is also a lot of kind of higher level tactic sharing that we're seeing across authoritarian governments anyway. One of the things that we've learned recently is that in North Korea, they've deployed new national identity cards. Those national identity cards do, in many instances, have a smart chip in them, much like what we see in China and elsewhere, and that those smart chips have a lot of information about a person on them. You also have to go in to physically get your new identity card issued to you, and they have been drawing blood when you go in a very Korean way. The blood type is listed on the national ID card, but that sample, like DNA collection, is something that we've clearly seen in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and increasingly in Inner Mongolia. And so where are they getting these ideas from? We've also seen a lot more surveillance technology inside North Korea that looks like it's Chinese produced. And so there's also that kind of sale of goods that's happening as well. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
Maybe okay, so we will have two more questions from them, and then we'll come to an end of our session.
Mine should be pretty short. Hi, I'm Andrew Petter, a recent master's graduate from SIS. So we have received reports recently, at least, that the North Korean troops that are currently in Russia and fighting in the war in Ukraine have access to a less restricted version of the internet, as we've seen in Russia, that they previously don't have access to in the DPRK. So my question is, like, this seems like a bit of a no-brainer. So do you believe that this was a calculated risk on behalf of the DPRK, saying, like, yeah, I mean, like, geopolitically, we're going to get, you know, increased image by having troops fighting with Russia, with the risk of this sort of like political contagion coming back if these troops do return? Thank you.
I think there is a little bit of a calculated risk that's happening. I also think, though, that there is a question of whether or not those individuals will be able to even return, even if they survive. And this is something that a number of refugees have raised with me, or escapees that are former KPA soldiers have shared, that it's possible that they just won't let them back because of that level of exposure. The government is not really messaging domestically right now that they've deployed those troops overseas. The only knowledge that exists inside North Korea that they've deployed anything is just through this word of mouth from like radio broadcasts that are going in, or, oh, my son may have had the opportunity to call me before he deployed, and I heard that they're going to Russia. And so there's a little bit of that, but it's not like this is something that the state media is talking about domestically. And so if they are trying to keep it quiet from the domestic population, then maybe they leave those 10,000 people at the front and say good luck to them. They are probably making money, a significant amount of money, from what our understanding is. It's possible that they gain international credibility within some circles through this. And so that is probably what's driving it, right? We've seen them at the BRICS. I think it was a Women, Peace and Security meeting that the BRICS grouping recently had, that the North Korean foreign minister joined. You know, are they looking for more opportunities to come out and to act like they belong in this multilateral international community space that they've been pretty isolated from for the last few decades? So the trade-off for him right now is pretty low risk. I think that could change, one, if more information gets into North Korea that all these soldiers are there. It also creates an interesting opportunity for us, though, to try and like message to the troops that are in Kursk. But the other component is that these are their elite special forces units. And so these are probably the most ideologically pure of the group. And so even with some exposure to little bits of the internet, they may have actually already had a little bit of that in North Korea anyway, through a lot of the media that's been getting in. And so, but these are the ones that they feel the most confident are probably the safest to send out.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for putting this together. My name is Jocelyn Castro, but I go by Yoshi, and I'm an intern for DRL. So little shout out to them. So my question for you is, how can we be better advocates for human rights in our careers, especially when dealing with policymakers or just being in spaces who might not regard human rights as a national security issue or a priority? Thank you.
This is kind of the age-old question, and one that I've wrestled with a lot over the course of my career in DRL, and one that took me a while to really learn how to tackle that piece. I think oftentimes in the human rights space, even within governments, right, not just the US government, but in other governments, we think of human rights work as something that feels good, right? We're doing good for other people, and we are doing good for other people in a lot of that work. But being able to tie back your work to those national security outcomes is really important, which is why I always prioritize when a new national security strategy comes out, reading that from start to finish, looking at the places where it connects back to my work. Okay, North Korea, countering North Korea's weapons development program is a top national security priority. Well, how does that relate to the work that I'm doing in human rights? Well, one, North Korean overseas workers are generating revenue that is funding that weapons program. So the work that I do to advocate for better labor conditions, to stop forced labor, to stop trafficking in persons, right, ties to that. What else are we doing? Well, North Korea is sending troops abroad. Okay, well, this is a really important place to talk about that. You know, the repression, the control of information in North Korea is what allows them to be able to behave that way. Oh, they're firing off missiles. Another area in which their repressive controls are allowing them to act erratically, which is a risk to all of us. So thinking through those components, being able to tell your story, being able to deliver a theory of change to people is really important. I tell people, yes, I do work in the Human Rights Bureau, or I work in the human rights space, but I am a national security foreign policy expert who happens to have this like sub-expertise in the human rights space, because it's not just in North Korea, but human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the coup in Burma, and the ongoing ethnic conflicts that are happening there, all tie back to us, whether, you know, the average American thinks about it or not. But if we can't tell that story to the American public, then that's really on us. And so I really encourage you to think about, yes, it's important to go in every day and to like see what Human Rights Watch is talking about and Amnesty is talking about, but also look at what those national security goals are, and see where you fit into that picture, and then to be able to translate that back to other people.
Wow, thank you so very much. This was such an amazing discussion. I learned so much from you and from everyone. Well, please join me thanking Ambassador Turner for her great service and contribution. Thank you so very much. So, Sarah, please take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much again, Ambassador Turner. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for those thoughtful questions, and to our audience for your many thoughtful questions. The ambassador has generously offered to stay around for a little bit for networking with folks. And so first, we'd love to take a group photo for anybody who would like to be in that. Ambassador Turner and Dr. Lee, I'll invite you guys to just go to the mic if people can just move in around them. I'll just grab it from here. And then after that, there's plenty of food. Please stay around and enjoy. And thank you all so much for joining us.